Thank you all for listening to my presentation today on near surface and near bottom distribution of right whales in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. A brief introduction to right whales for those of you that don't know them. They are long-lived cetaceans that are slow to mature and slow to reproduce. They filter typically on small crustaceans called copepods, and interestingly enough, at any time of the year, a small proportion of the population is missing in an unknown location somewhere. Despite that, their general distribution is across the North Atlantic, obviously with fewer animals in the European side thanks to whaling. So the majority of the population lives in the Florida, Georgia, South Carolina area in the winter and in the Cape Cod Bay and Bay of Fundy area in the summer. However, things have been changing. Over the last decade, there's been a shift of the whales from the Bay of Fundy area into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, which is a heavily trafficked area and one of the densest fished areas in the world, especially with bottom set crab and lobster. This is thought to be a consequence of changing prey distribution and quality as a result of climate change. And now 40% of the population spends the time in the Gulf of St. Lawrence over the summer at some point, making it a very important area for the species. Especially when you consider that over the last 10 years, there's also been a decline in the number of whales, down to just around about 336 animals at the end of 2020. Threats to right whales, prevalently humans, predominantly related to vessel strikes and entanglement. Many of those lead to mortalities, although not all. As you can see here, there's a general trend for around about 2 to 4 mortalities a year, which exceeds the sustainable less than 1 allowed. And in 2017 and 2019, as the animals moved into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, there were a couple of peaks in mortalities. As I said, vessel strikes, entanglement are driving that mortality rate. However, they also contribute to sublethal effects when they don't kill the animals to varying degrees, from sort of lesser scarring up to more serious injuries, which is likely to lead to the fatality of the animal over the long term. Combine this with the shift in prey distribution and quality, throw in all of the human-related disturbance and stress from noise, pollution, and other things, and it's clear that the North Atlantic right whale is not nearly as healthy as its related species elsewhere in the world. And this is not just a problem for the individual animal, but it's also suppressing their reproduction, which seems to be contributing to this decline in recent years. Our objective of this work is pretty simple. We know that the animals are feeding at the surface in Cape Cod Bay, and that they were feeding at the bottom, as demonstrated by the mud on the head, in the Bay of Fundy. So given this overlap with a new overlap with different human activities in different parts of the world, in the Gulf of St. Lawrence, we want to find out what they're doing in terms of feeding in the Gulf of St. Lawrence. To do this, we have decided to deploy animal-borne instruments to look at that feeding behavior and find out where it is in the water column, but also look at the amount of time they're spending in the different regions in the water column to hone in on the extent of overlap and the potential exposure to the different human activities in the Gulf. As I said, for methods, we use animal-borne tag, and our tag of choice is the D tag, because it contains dual stereo hydrophones, along with accelerometers, time depth recorders, and other instrumentation in a suction cup attached package, so it's non-invasive, with a predetermined programmable release, so it will come off when you tell it to. We used the Coriolis in 2019 and 2020 to take our Zodiac out to the animals, where we could approach them closely using the Zodiac and deploy the tags at the end of a large pole. The VHF signal inside then told us where the animal was and ultimately where the tag was when it came off, so we could collect it and get at all the data inside. We achieved this 5 times, despite some trouble with winches and technical problems with Zodiacs. Unfortunately, animal 3, as soon as we tagged it, decided to enter into a SAG behavior. This is a surface active group, which is a very tactile social activity where the whales rub over each other. Consequently, one of them knocked off the tag after just 13 minutes. We have a range of results nonetheless. including the standard time depth output, which here is represented by surface, descent, flat bottom, and ascent periods. This animal one, was tagged in around about 80 meters of water, so that was used as our proxy bottom depth for the whole duration of the dives and the tag deployment. Anything within 5 meters of the surface was considered surface behavior. Any dives where the deep maximum depth part went to 15 meters or less was considered a shallow dive. Dives within the bottom 15 meters were bottom dives, and anything in between was mid-water. Now you can see here a lot of information if you pause it. However, I want to draw your attention to the fact that the surface time and the shallow dives combined was up to 74% of the proportion of time in the deployments that were done for each of these animals. When you separate out the transits as the ascent and the descents and the midwater dives, and you're just left with the bottom time within that last 15 meters of the water column, you can see here that up to 58% of the time for each individual animal was spent in that bottom 15 meters. With the exception of number 3, again, that was a surface active group behavior, and so they don't go very deep in the water. We also separated the dives out by different dive types because they are known to be associated with different behaviors. For example, V-shaped dives are often associated with travel or possibly exploratory dives into different depths looking for food. U-shaped dives are very closely associated with foraging across multiple species, and parabolic dives have been seen to be associated with sleeping in a couple of small odontocetes. Uneven dives are other sorts of behavior, possibly social, often interrupted dives of various kinds, or where the animal changed its mind about what it was doing. A little bit more information about our tags and the information we have here. This is an example U-shaped dive from tag 4, where the animal was tagged in 120 meters of depth. So the animal is going to the bottom. This next graph represents the pitch of the animal from the accelerometer data. And you can see here the fluking represented by this sort of sinusoidal signal. You can see harder fluking here, represented by an increase in the amplitude of that signal. Then you have a little bit of sort of peaks here at the beginning of the dive and the beginning of the ascent as the animal reorientates either up or down accordingly. Then there's corrections as the animal levels off, both at the beginning of the bottom and at the beginning of the surface phase. Then you can see gliding here, where the animal isn't fluking at all. It's not pumping its tail to move, so it's just sort of cruising through the water column represented by these red periods. But all in all, this is a very high energy dive, potential foraging periods in here for sure, a lot of different changing in orientation. In contrast here, we have a parabolic dive. Same animal, same water depth, but only going to 9 meters of the 120 available. You can see the fluking rate is much slower than in the previous dive, so the animal's really not pumping very hard at all. There's no real change in orientation at the beginning of the dives, unlike the previous ones. However, there is remaining a correction at the end, so the animal seems to be just sort of sinking in at the beginning. There's still the gliding phase. However, in this case, it's over the most of the dive, not just briefly in the ascent and descents. And that's consistent from one dive to the next. So this is a low activity dive that's consistent with that seen as sleeping in the porpoise and bottlenose dolphin elsewhere. Where are these dives seen in the water column? Well, the parabolic dives make up most of the dives seen in the shallow water area. In the midwater, most of the dives are the uneven dives. Although in the next slide, when we consider the proportion of time, we also throw in the transits as well. 80% of all the dives within the bottom 15 meters are these U-shaped dives that are closely associated with foraging, and our results seem to be consistent with that foraging use of these dives. So, summary of all of this information and a few of the implications. In total, the whales in this area are spending 82% of their time either within 15 meters of the surface or the bottom. They're foraging at or near the bottom, spending around about 1/3 to 2/3 of their time in that near bottom area. And they're predominantly in those high activity U-shaped dives. So we're pretty confident this is actually foraging behavior. And given that they have to forage with their mouth open, this is obviously a serious concern for fisheries, as a right whale with an open mouth is likely to get entangled in bottom lines, especially floating bottom lines or derelict gear that's been lost at the bottom of the ocean. At the surface, they're breathing, they're engaging in this social activity, and they're potentially sleeping at or near the surface. The problem with that, of course, is if you're spending 50 to 75% of your time within 50 meters of the surface in a low activity, low attention behavior, it's a big concern for shipping, especially when you are below the surface, so that you can still be struck, but you're not observable to people on board the vessel. Also a concern for fisheries, relation to entanglement in end lines that tend to spaghetti, where loose rope aggregates at the surface to make sure they have enough cord on there to get a buoy at the surface under any current condition. Finally, the rest of the dives are made up of midwater dives. However, that's only on average 2% of the remaining tag duration. So most of the animals are spending their time in midwater only to transit to or from the bottom. Remember, this is only a pilot, only 5 tags were deployed and one was only for 30 minutes. And all the data is in the daytime, so clearly we need more data. And that's what I would very much like to find ways to achieve in the near future. Thanks to everyone involved, including Mike and Christian, for their concerted efforts to get the tags on the whales, and all the field crew that helped support the work, and the crew of the Coriolis and the logistics team behind the scenes. Thank you all for listening. And if you have any questions, please do drop me a line.